In the iron-cold winter of 1891, in the hard-scrabble mining camps threaded through the Bitterroot Range, there was no fear greater than the one that came on four paws. It had been dubbed Old One-Eye, a ghost-grey wolf of impossible size and spectral cunning. By the third week of November, it was no longer a ghost. It was a surgeon. It had, with terrifying precision, hospitalized 5 men. The first 2, miners from the upper creek, were left with shredded forearms. The third, a trapper named Silas, lost 3 fingers and the use of his right hand. The fourth and fifth, Hollis and Reed, part of an armed posse, were dragged back to the settlement near present-day Darby, Montana, looking like they had been fed through a threshing machine. Hollis's left leg was laid open to the bone, the serrated marks of the wolf's teeth clear in the sub-zero air. The camp was under siege. The prevailing wisdom, championed by the territorial bounty and the hardened experience of men like Jedediah Stone, was simple: lead and steal. They responded with .45-70 government rifles, strychnine-laced suite, and new heavy-springed No. 4 Newhouse traps. Yet every trap was sprung, every bait stolen, and another man injured. The wolf, it seemed, was immune to their engineering. While Stone and his remaining men huddled around their stove, cleaning rifles and boiling in a toxic stew of fear and rage, 10-year-old Ilara Vance stood at the edge of her family's homestead, 2 miles down the valley. She was humming a low, steady tune. The men saw a monster to be eliminated. She saw a puzzle, and in the deepening blue of the twilight, she watched the grey shadow on the far ridge. It was not hunting. It was waiting. What did this small, observant child understand about the physics of survival and the mechanics of a predator that 5 experienced armed frontiersmen had completely missed? The year was 1891. The Bitterroots were not a frontier. They were a battleground. This was not the era of romantic preservation. It was an age of extraction. Men had come to tear wealth from the ground, and anything that interfered, be it granite, weather, or wolf, was an obstacle to be pulverized. The doctrine of the time was clear, published in settlers' guides and reinforced by the hard-won bloody lessons of the plains. Wolves were vermin. They were portrayed as creatures of pure malice, killers of livestock and, if given the chance, men. The official recommendation, backed by bounties, $5 per pelt, nearly a week's wages for a laborer, was total extermination. The tools were brutal and direct: the leg-hold trap, the poison bait, and the high-caliber rifle. There was no nuance. Jedediah Stone was the physical embodiment of this doctrine. A veteran of the Plains Wars, he trusted only what he could measure in powder, weight, and spring tension. He ran his trapping lines with military precision, his traps boiled in pine resin to mask the human scent, his bait stations set in textbook bottlenecks. Everyone in the valley trusted this method. It was the heito certo, the only way. It was a philosophy of overwhelming force, a belief that nature was an adversary to be dominated through sheer, unyielding pressure. This was what the books mandated. But the Vances, on their small, wind-scoured homestead, didn't read the same books. The failure of the conventional method was not just dramatic, it was quantifiable, measured in blood, terror, and lost productivity. Jedediah Stone's system, the one trusted by the entire settlement, was collapsing. Let's analyze the failure. The standard setup involved 24 Newhouse No. 4 and No. 5 traps. The No. 4, with a 5.5-inch jaw spread, was designed for coyotes, but the No. 5 was a bear trap, weighing over 17 pounds with double springs, delivering over 90 pounds of force, easily enough to shatter a wolf's leg. Stone set them near the recent attacks, baited with deer offal and laced with strychnine, calculating that the wolf's arrogance would be its downfall. He was wrong. The first trapper to check the line, Silas, found his traps sprung, the heavy jaws empty, the bait gone. The snow told an impossible story. The wolf had methodically dug up the traps from the side, using the chain's drag anchor as leverage to trigger them at a distance. It was then, as Silas knelt in disbelief, that the wolf attacked. It did not come from the front, but from the dense pine cover to his right, a silent charge that ended with Silas's hand in its jaws. The next attempt was the posse, Stone, Hollis, and Reed. They carried 45-70 rifles, firing a 405-grain lead bullet capable of stopping a bison. They tracked the wolf for 6 hours into a box canyon. But the wolf wasn't being tracked, it was leading them. It used the terrain, moving along ridges where the wind masked its scent, using the glare of the low-angle sun to blind them. When it attacked Hollis, it came from above, dropping off a 10-foot ledge. The sheer speed of the assault rendered the heavy, slow lever-action rifles useless. By the time Stone and Reed could fire, Hollis was down, and the wolf was gone, melting back into the landscape. Dr. Aris Thorne, the settlement's physician and a naturalist by training, documented the cost. In his ledger, he noted 5 men incapacitated, productive labor loss, 120 man-hours this week alone, medical supplies expended, 3 yards of carbolic gauze, 4 ounces of laudanum, 8 ounces of chloroform. Morale shattered. The temperature inside the main bunkhouse, despite a roaring stove, felt colder than the 15-degree scribe outside. Stone's system of brute force hadn't just failed, it had actively backfired, turning a nuisance into a tactical, efficient enemy. Ilara Vance was a product of a different education. Her father, Amos, was a quiet man, a former Union field engineer who had seen enough of humanity's brute force during the siege of Vicksburg. He had come west, not to conquer the land, but to disappear into it. He built his homestead on a principle he'd learned in the war. Observation is a better defense than a taller wall. While other settlers cleared fields, Amos sat for days, mapping the game trails, the wind patterns, and the watershed. He engaged with the local Salish, not to trade, but to listen. From them, Ilara learned something the settlers had forgotten. The forest was a language. She didn't just see a wolf, she saw the wolf. She had learned to read its scat, to understand the meaning of a footprint's depth, to differentiate the bark of territory from the howl of hunger. She learned the non-threatening safety calls of the chickadee and the jay, sounds that signaled to the entire forest that there was no predator nearby. The community viewed the Vances with deep suspicion. Their small cabin was lazy, lacking the fortress-like palisade of their neighbors. Their refusal to join the bounty hunts was seen as cowardly, even traitorous. While Jedediah Stone saw a demon, Ilara, observing from 300 yards with her father's field glass, saw a large female, favoring its left foreleg with a gait that was not predatory, but pained. Ilara's first implementation was not a trap, it was a test of a hypothesis. While Stone was laying his iron, Ilara began her own system, rooted in behavioral mechanics rather than brute force. She knew the wolf was hungry. Its pained gait meant it was too slow to hunt deer. The attacks on the men were defensive, likely near a kill or, she suspected, a den. Her goal was not to capture it, but to de-escalate it. She took scraps from their smokehouse, suet, cracked bones, and began leaving them on a large, flat boulder 500 yards from her cabin, a neutral, open space. She did this at the same time every day, just before dusk. After leaving the food, she would walk back 200 yards and sit, partially hidden, and sing. It was not a song in the human sense. It was a low, steady hum mixed with the high, precise chickadee call of the local mountain bird. It was a signal, "I am not a threat. This is not a trap." At first, the food remained untouched for days. Stone, passing by, saw the scraps and scoffed. "You're feeding it," he spat. "You're ringing the dinner bell for that beast to come kill us all." Amos merely placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Ilara continued. After a week, the food was gone. A week later, she watched through the glass as the wolf appeared at dusk, limped to the rock, ate, and then, instead of vanishing, it sat and watched her for a full minute before disappearing. Her system, built of routine, sound, and passive offering, had established the first successful non-violent contact. The conflict was now one of competing engineering philosophies. On one side was Jedediah Stone, representing the 19th century industrial mind, mass, force, and elimination. To Stone, the wolf was a faulty component in the machine of the frontier, and the solution was a bigger hammer. If a number 4 trap failed, use a number 5. If a rifle bullet failed, use poison. His entire strategy was based on conduction, a direct, kinetic transfer of energy to destroy the problem. He believed the only way to make the camp safe was to increase the pressure on the wolf until it broke. On the other side was Ilara Vance, representing a systems-based approach, observation, pattern, and de-escalation. She understood the principles of convection and flow. The wolf was not a static object, it was a dynamic part of the environment, a flow of energy. Her strategy was to alter the conditions that made the wolf a threat. She recognized that Stone's pressure was the very thing creating the violence. The wolf was caught in a feedback loop of fear and aggression. Stone was trying to cap a volcano. Ilara was trying to vent the pressure. This was a battle of ideas. Brute force attrition versus behavioral engineering. Dr. Aris Thorne, the man of science, was now the critical observer. He had grown weary of Stone's failing, bloody tactics and was increasingly fascinated by the Vance's insane project. He began to accompany Ilara, standing with her at the 200-yard observation point, his thermometer and notebook in hand. He began to log the data. Method A. Stone. 4 armed men, 12 hours of active hunting, temperature 5 degrees Celsius. Result 0 sightings. Ammunition expended 0. Morale low. Subsequent attack on Hollis and Reed, 2 men severely injured. Method B. Vance. 1 girl, 1 hour of passive observation. Temperature 5 degrees Celsius. Result 1 sighting at 500 yards. Wolf retrieves food, no aggression. Thorne's clinical eye noted the details Ilara already knew. The animal's gait is severely compromised, he wrote in his journal on November 28th. Left foreleg. It does not move like a predator but like a casualty. Stone's traps, with their iron scent, must be triggering a defensive, not predatory response. The other settlers remained skeptical. But Thorne, the camp's only intellectual authority, was now convinced the girl was onto something. He began to believe the problem was not one of malice, but of mechanics. The breakthrough came when Ilara, emboldened by the wolf's routine, moved her observation point, searching for the cause of the limp. With her father and Dr. Thorne, she glassed the ridges, cross-referencing the wolf's tracks with the terrain. She found the spot. It was not a den. It was a disaster site. In a shallow ravine, half covered by an early snow, lay the remnants of an old, forgotten trapline. And in the middle of it was the source of the entire conflict. The wolf, the large female, was not the only one. There were 2 pups, frozen solid, dead for weeks, and tangled around the mother's left leg, a testament to her desperate struggle, was an old, triple-pronged grapple drag, the kind used in place of a stake. The iron prongs, perhaps 1.5 inches long, were embedded deep in her shoulder, the chain wrapped tight. The tissue was black and swollen with infection. Ilara had uncovered the system. Layer 1, the trauma. The wolf had been caught likely weeks ago and had torn the grapple free from its anchor. Layer 2, the infection. The iron was septic. She was dying slowly, in agonizing, constant pain. Layer 3, the pups. She had been unable to hunt. Her pups had starved. Layer 4, the trigger. Stone's new traps. The smell of iron, the sound of the snap, the presence of men were not a new threat. They were a reenactment of the event that had destroyed her life. She was not attacking the men. She was attacking the trauma they represented. The 5 hospitalizations were not acts of a monster. They were the desperate, pain-maddened defenses of a mother driven insane by septic iron. The climate itself provided the final test. A true Arctic clipper descended, plunging the valley to 35 degrees. The wind howled at 50 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. The camp was in survival mode, but Jedediah Stone saw it as an opportunity. "The beast will be weak. It's now or never," he declared. Over Dr. Thorne's furious objections, Stone and two other men, Reed and Hollis, partially recovered, ventured out. They found the wolf, driven by the cold and madness, near the ravine. The wind was so loud they couldn't hear each other. Reed fired, the 45-70's report sounding flat and dead in the dense air. He missed, the bullet screaming off the granite. In the swirling snow, the grey shadow charged. It was on Reed before he could work the lever, then threw itself at Stone, knocking his rifle from his frozen hands. The wolf locked its jaws on Stone's thigh, and this time it did not let go. It was a climax of brute force, and Stone had lost. But Ilara had seen them leave. She had followed, carrying a canvas bundle. She arrived at the ridge overlooking the ravine just as Stone went down. The men were screaming. The wolf was shaking Stone like a doll, its own blood staining the snow from where its leg wound had torn open. Ilara did not shout. She stood against the wind and began to sing. It was the high-pitched, clear, repetitive call of the chickadee, the all-clear signal, the sound she had used every day at the feeding rock. It was a sound that had no association with pain, iron, or death. It cut through the blizzard's roar. The wolf, in its pain-fueled rage, paused, the pressure on Stone's leg released. The animal looked up, confused, its head tilted. It recognized the sound, the pattern, the signal of non-threat. The neurological circuit of its rage was momentarily broken. In that instant, Amos Vance and Dr. Thorne arrived, dragging the canvas tarp. The wolf was torn, balanced on a knife edge between the immediate threat, Stone, and the neutral signal, Ilara. It was too weak, too cold, too confused to fight both. Amos threw the laudanum-laced deer meat they had prepared. The wolf, starved and exhausted, took it. Within 2 minutes, its legs buckled. This was the operation. In the 35-degree blizzard, lit by a single guttering railroad lantern, Dr. Thorne became a field surgeon. "Hold the light! Hold her steady!" he yelled at Amos. He cut the pants from Stone's leg, a severe femoral artery bleed. Amos applied pressure while Thorne turned to the wolf. Its pulse was faint. It took them 40 minutes, their fingers burning with frostbite, to perform the technical miracle. Thorne used heavy wire cutters to snap the chain and pry the iron prongs from the wolf's septic shoulder. The wound was horrific. He packed it with carbolic gauze and stitched it crudely with gut. All the while, Ilara stood just yards away, humming her low, steady tune, her voice the only anchor in the storm, keeping the animal in its semi-conscious state. They had saved Stone. They had disarmed the wolf. They hauled Jedediah Stone back to the bunkhouse on the canvas tarp, a ghost white man who had seen his entire philosophy collapse. They left the wolf in the ravine, covered by a blanket. The camp was silent, dumbstruck. The data was undeniable. The brute force method, practiced by 5 experienced men, had resulted in 5 hospitalizations, 1 permanent disability, Stone's leg would never bend correctly again, and a total failure to neutralize the threat. The cost was astronomical in lost labor and medical supplies. The Vance method, a system of behavioral engineering deployed by a 10-year-old girl, 1 homesteader and 1 doctor, had ended the crisis in 1 night. The total cost, 1 blanket, a quarter bottle of laudanum, and the scraps from their table. When the blizzard broke 3 days later, Dr. Thorne and Amos returned to the ravine. The wolf was gone. The bloody blanket, the severed iron grapple, and the cut chain were all that remained. The attacks stopped. They never happened again. Thorne's official report, sent back east to a small Boston naturalist society, was not titled "The Defeat of a Monster." It was titled A Case Study in Sustained Pain-Induced Aggression in Canis Lupus and its Resolution via Non-Kinetic Intervention. By the spring of 1892, the valley was visibly different. The Vances were no longer outcasts. Jedediah Stone, now walking with a thick hickory cane, spent his afternoons on the Vances' porch, teaching Alara how to use a navigation compass. He had stopped trapping and started teaching. The terror of Old One-Eye was gone. The bounty rules in their small district were quietly rewritten. The war on predators had, in this one small pocket of the Rockies, found an armistice. The legacy was not the song, it was the shift in perspective. Alara Vance had not tamed a wild beast. She had simply been the first engineer to correctly identify the problem. The settlers had been fighting a wolf, but the enemy was never the wolf. It was the iron. It was the simple, devastating physics of pain. They learned that survival on the frontier was not about the force of your strike, but about the accuracy of your observation.